What is up, guys? Welcome to the Meaning of Podcast. I am Andres.
This is RB3.
I'm Sabrina. You said it in Spanish. I'm going to say Dorina instead of Dorina. So there you go.
Do you say Dorina?
Well,
I always say Andres.
I had to Americanize it because nobody understood me for
really?
years.
No. Listen, this is not the podcast.
That was
for
gonna
that.
say,
Yeah.
Sweet.
You already know.
We're proud of our.
Awesome.
We're proud of where we come from. But either way, guys, this is the Meaning of Podcast. We're doing a very special episode. As you can see, we have a very special guest.
Am I special?
Dorina is coming in.
What
Applause.
up? Finally.
Finally. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming in.
I finally got an invite. Everybody's been on
Super
this except
exclusive.
me.
No,
Yeah.
it's funny because I've always wanted to have you on, but I always feel I told you when we were texting me, and I was like, man, I feel bad asking people to stay longer when they're already here.
Yeah.
Like I remember when Christian,
Christian Rubel-Copper.
Christian Rubel-Copper, I was going to say Copster, but I already said Copster. When he first came in here, I remember the first time because he was our first guest or our second guest, but he was like drinking coffee and he was like, all right, guys, I'm so happy to be here, and I was just like, dude. You can tell it's a struggle to stay when you're already here in the morning.
Well, especially those guys, because the production guys work so
hardest
hard.
working
Yeah.
guys in Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tired today, but they work harder than
That's
I
what
do.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's why I always feel bad being like, is she cool with staying longer? And you texted me back and you're like, yeah. And I was like, oh, of course.
Thank you. Such a night before separation.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
I am very busy, but because of Thanksgiving week and I'm not leaving until tomorrow, I was like, this is the perfect opportunity. And then I was like, what do you want to talk about? And I was like, Blade Runner? And he's like, okay. I was like, well, yeah, I'm going to stay for Blade Runner talk with my favorite people. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Of course.
Obviously, I want to get into you two guys are probably some of the biggest Blade Runner fans I know. Obviously, there's plenty of you guys.
Yeah.
But since I have you guys here, I'm so excited to talk about this movie because I'm a Ridley Scott guy and I have a lot of Ridley Scott thoughts. But Blade Runner is what you guys are masters of. And obviously, I want to get to you, Sabrina, to your connection to this movie. And I'll go around the table. I'll start with you, Dorina. What is your connection to this movie? What is your, whether it's your first memory of watching it, your first reaction, or when you first fell in love with this movie?
Well, I am a replicant. So there's that.
Okay.
No, I remember watching the movie when I was a kid, but not really understanding what was happening. And I just saw it in I didn't see it in the theater. Even though I grew up in the 80s, I didn't get to see it in the theater because it was actually released the year I was born, in 82. But as a child of the 80s, I watched it on TV, and I never knew what was going on, but I just liked the way it looked, I feel like. And because I liked Harrison Ford as a kid and I liked Indiana Jones and Han Solo, I just thought, I guess, this Rick Deckard guy is the hero and he's trying to fight these bad, evil replicants, right? And then I got older and I rewatched it and I realized how wrong I was as a kid to think that Harrison Ford's character was the hero because he's hunting down people that have, or not people, but creatures or living creatures that have been created by humans, and that these, Tyrell has basically said, this is how much life you have
for your lifespan.
Exactly. And then it's going to be over, and you're only here to serve the human race and not yourself. And I got so obsessed with it because of my own obsession with death, and I get very philosophical, existential about this stuff. So then I realized, oh no, Roy Batty is the guy that I actually root for in this movie, and I just immediately became obsessed. The other thing too is I'm a huge soundtrack nerd, and
Vangelis' score for this movie.
It's the best soundtrack ever made, in my opinion. I listened to that soundtrack with my mom all the time when I was a kid. I didn't understand the movie. I was just obsessed. I'm so obsessed with it that I can probably hum the music and the arrangements, even though it's all synthesizers and stuff.
Right.
So yeah. And then I got to see the final cut when it was released, I think 2007.
2007.
Yeah. And they actually had a screening at the $1 Million Theater across from the Bradbury Building, and so they filmed. Those are two film locations from the movie. So I got that amazing experience, and I remember watching it with all these other Blade Runner nerds there, and it was just kind of like, oh yeah, I found my people.
That's
so yeah,
amazing.
so since 2007, I'm like, this is my favorite movie ever.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is this really your favorite movie?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
That's amazing.
I'm
What's
so
up?
obsessed with it.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
I'll jump to you, Sabrina.
Yeah, so my dad was a huge Harrison Ford fan. So I grew up watching Star Wars, obviously Indiana Jones, and then this one as well. And I had the same experience where I didn't understand it, but I really liked to watch it, and he had a good time watching it. So it kind of just like made me happy to like spend that time with him. You know, we watched a lot of movies. So yeah, so then when this one came out, we went to go see it in theaters. So it was really cool.
Have you like revisited it or rewatched it recently? Or?
So I've seen 2 of the cuts. I've seen the final cut and then I think the director's cut. So I've seen those 2 a few times each. I like the final cut the best. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
I
the
think
best.
that's the one. That,
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
That's
So-
the correct answer.
Yeah, so
Sabrina.
that's the one I was like looking at you. I'm like, is she gonna hit me? But yeah, so I've seen both of those, like that one the best, and then saw 2049 in theaters when that one came out. Long one. So I tried to revisit it today, but only got halfway through.
I was going to say it's a long movie.
It's a long one.
I don't think
But-
there's enough time in the day to watch
Yeah.
that movie.
Yeah. Good deal.
So, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
On to you, man.
Oh, me? Okay,
Yeah.
so Blade Runner is also one of my favorite movies. I watched it when I just, as you're getting into film education, a lot of people give you those movies that you have to watch, and Blade Runner is on the top of a lot of people's list. So when I first watched it, I watched the original cut, by the way. I saw it on cable TV.
Wait, the theatrical release was the first cut you saw?
Yes.
Oh, that
Yeah,
must have
yeah.
been weird.
It is weird because you know why? After I actually watched all the different cuts of this movie, and for me personally, I actually liked the theatrical cut a whole lot. I liked it for some reason, the cheesy narration. I like that. I like it because what I like about Blade Runner is that my favorite genre of all time is noir. Is the old school.
I was gonna say.
1930s, 40s, 50s noir films. I talk about that all the time on this podcast. Even my favorite animated film, technically animated film, is Who Framed Roger Rabbit because it's a noir animation.
Man, RB3.
Yeah. The Big Lebowski is my favorite comedy, noir comedy. So Blade Runner it's always been a science fiction film that I've always loved and admired for that vibe. So the voiceover, the narration, it feels cheesy. Is very,
it's very noir.
hokey. It's very noir, and it's funny because it's almost secondhand noir because a lot of noir films actually don't have narration like that. A lot of noir films don't have the weird saxophone that plays like throughout this movie sometimes. A lot of noirs don't have that, but that's the perception that we have of this genre, and it kind of plays on that. So I'm a big fan of it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What do you? So what's your favorite? Is that your favorite cut, or the final cut is your favorite cut, or what?
Well, the final cut answers the questions. I mean,
Okay.
the final cut does have a definitive answer for everything. As to where the theatrical cut, you could tell like this wasn't what Ridley Scott and the gang wanted to make. But I enjoy the charm of the theatrical cut.
Right.
So I guess if I'm going to go rewatch Blade Runner, I'll watch it with the narration just to have that vibe. But-
How much is the love that you guys have for this movie, and I'll throw you in as well, the aesthetic, just purely on a visual scale, what this movie means as far as filmmaking in general, as far as creating an entire genre that I personally have a bigger connection to because I'm a bigger Ghost in the Shell guy than a Blade Runner guy.
a direct line of influence.
A direct line of influence, and I consider Ghost in the Shell to be the greatest of all time.
I think it's my favorite anime.
There you go,
Yeah.
and it's probably my favorite anime of all time, unless Attack on Titan season 4. But we'll get into that. But that's like a whole different level. I think Ghost in the Shell, Standalone Complex. I don't know. Have you seen Standalone Complex?
No.
No one has seen Standalone
No,
Complex.
I want to. I just haven't yet.
It's 2 seasons. It's incredible. It just jumps off what the film is doing.
Right.
And I think it's, like I said, the greatest anime of all time. So I'm much more of a cyberpunk guy than I am a Blade Runner guy. But the genre essentially was created just purely off aesthetic with the high tech inside this kind of street level world.
Right.
Because this is set in LA, and it's kind of like you get that LA vibe with the multicultural aspect of this film that Ridley Scott created. So how much of this, on a visual scale, this rank in your favorite all-time or greatest of all time on a cinematic level?
I mean, especially because it's interesting. I just on Collider Live in this room, which is so weird to be here at night as well. We interviewed the Tarantino documentary director.
I saw that. I saw that.
Tara
Yeah.
Wood, and I love the documentary because it's a celebration of his films. But they also speak, cast and crew that he's worked with his whole life. They speak as to the fact that he's not a fan of digital, so maybe it's because of my age and the movies I grew up with, but if you show me a movie that looks like Blade Runner where you didn't use computers, that's incredible. Because not only that these people build these models, but it's not just like Sid Mead's designs, the beautiful art that he concept art that he came up with,
right.
But to create these sets and these studios and to watch that movie now, however long it's been, like decades later, and it still looks
as
like it could exist, and it still looks like you believe that you're immersed in that world, and it's all thanks to the cinematography and the set design, and I think it's one of the most beautiful looking movies, especially if you see it on the big screen. It's a completely different experience than if you see it on your TV.
That's the one thing I haven't been able to do. I've always wanted to see a Blade Runner on the big screen.
Well, RB3, I see it once a year, so you should
really?
come with me.
Oh yeah, no, I most definitely will. Yeah, absolutely.
But how about you, man? As far as just visually, this movie can say a lot just purely with the volume all the way down, just purely off aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the aesthetic. I mean, talking about the aesthetic in and of itself, the cramped spaces, the overly compacted. I mean, it seems like everybody is stacked on top of each other in terms of like the production, in terms of the extras, and in terms of the amount of people in the space. Not to mention the actual sets themselves are all complicated and extremely detailed.
The umbrellas, like there's so much crazy.
And it establishes so much mythology. Really, Scott's a really beautiful visual filmmaker because he spent so much time making commercials and music videos before he started making movies. So he has a very bold, futuristic kind of visual aesthetic that we talk about music video directors a lot and commercial directors a lot. They have to have that bold aesthetic to tell stories, visual stories in shortest amount of time. So when you watch a movie like Blade Runner, you get just a lot of little moments of just pure visual spectacle, not really for the expense of like the story, but for the expense of just establishing the world. I think there's one shot where Harrison Ford is walking away with, I forgot who's the character's name, but he's walking away and the camera just kind of holds and pans over as we see like those bikers with the little lights going through the little street alley.
Is he working with like Gaff or Leon or?
I think Leon. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's a real brief moment, but it goes to show how he's just able to leave the camera there and give you those, especially with both Star Wars and Ridley Scott's Alien kind of being the first two sci-fi movies to establish like the dirty production design inside of a sci-fi universe.
Yes.
Particularly Alien with the, being in space, but this adds it to a human level, to an LA level that's practical and adapts to it. So it's really great.
Yeah. Sabrina.
Yeah. When I watched it when I was a kid, I was just kind of really captivated just purely on the visuals because I didn't understand it as well. And the world building, everything, it's so interesting. Like it's something that as you're watching it, you feel like you're like stepping into it. And you really understand a lot of it just by the way it looks, even if you don't understand the story. So
100%. And that's kind of where I was going too, is this idea, being an anime fan, I've always told you and I've always told anyone, the number one important thing that an anime can do is world building. That's the first thing you have to do inside an anime. That's the biggest pitch you have in a pilot inside an anime, and that's the biggest thing Blade Runner does, is that it's one of the best world-building movies ever, to the point that it creates an entire genre. And to think that, we have a long history of cinema, right? We've seen sci-fi before, this isn't new, but we've never seen cyberpunk before. And the fact that Ridley Scott, like you said, kind of created gritty sci-fi with Alien and then followed it up with this movie and make something an entire new genre is just mind-blowing. The fact that he gave this to cinema, and now whether it's in anime form, whether it's in live action form,
The Matrix,
Dark City, whether we see so many films that kind of take this style and take this genre and ran with it to make new films and to make filmmakers that are inspired by this movie, and I just think that's incredible.
Yeah. Did you guys see the Blade Runner anime?
Yes.
So
I saw the short
anime?
yeah.
yes.
So because I think it was either right after or before
was before
2049. It was like
2049,
for promotional purposes. But
was on Crunchyroll.
I did see that.
Yeah,
Okay. I did.
I thought it was great, but what's interesting is I actually grew up hating anime because I didn't really see good anime. Like everybody in Mexico loved Dragon Ball Z and like Caballeros del Zodiaco. I hated that shit. I don't know. It was so. I think it's because I hated telenovelas so much that I was
It
like,
felt
this
like
is overly dramatic.
Yeah.
I'm over these people crying every episode. I can't handle this shit. Super Campeones, remember like the soccer one? I was like, oh, he's just like jumping on air about to hit the ball, and you're like just the whole cartoon is 30 minutes of him thinking about kicking the ball, and I cannot do this, and I love soccer. But anyways, I didn't like it until I saw Ghost in the Shell and like the Studio Ghibli movies, the Miyazaki movies, and I saw Paprika, like I saw what anime could actually do, and so it was interesting to see the Blade Runner anime shorts now, because now that I can appreciate the genre, you're totally right, Ace, that you can, it looks so beautiful. I was like, as a lover of this film, I thought they did such a fantastic job with the way the anime looked. I loved it so much.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but the anime came from the creator of Cowboy Bebop, who Cowboy Bebop,
the director of Cowboy Bebop.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the director of Cowboy Bebop, who he has cited Blade Runner as an inspiration for Cowboy Bebop originally. So it's kind of cool seeing that come full circle back around to where he's making a Blade Runner short film.
Cool.
Yeah.
Again, this is kind of Blade Runner created cyberpunk, and there's been a lot of cyberpunk movies, but as a anime dude, there's been more cyberpunk animes than movies in Hollywood. And that's kind of the interesting aspect of this movie, is the idea that Ridley Scott created a film that not only influenced film directors in Hollywood, but a lot of Japanese animators and a lot of Japanese directors like Cowboy Bebop, Ghost in the Shell, whatever it is you want to name. There's a ton of cyberpunk anime out there, and that I personally love. Before we move on to the themes, because I feel like that's the biggest part of the movie, that's the chunkiest part of the movie.
Yeah, we got a lot to talk about.
We have a lot to talk about, because I want to move on to the themes, because that's probably the biggest things that I have to say. We have to, and you mentioned it already, but we have to talk about the score. The score.
I can talk about the score for 3 hours.
Yes. The score in this is another example of what nowadays we're seeing that scores and composers are trying to do now with current movies, bringing back the synthesizer, bringing back this 80s feel just by... I still feel, and I told you this when we did our review, I still listen to the freaking Stranger Things soundtrack. Every season they release those guys. I forget their names, but I gave them a shout out last time when we did our Stranger Things review. I have that shit on repeat, man. I think that score is the best part of Stranger Things. It's so freaking good.
Aren't they called Survive or something? I forget.
No, it's two guys.
One?
It's like they have like two names.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll look it up.
But they're a part of a band too, but I forget the name of the band.
Season 2 had the best
I thought
score.
it was Survive.
Season 2 was incredible, but season 3 was so good too, man. I love it. But either way, the fact that this score and the composer influence what we're doing now to scores, and you're a big score guy. I'm a big score guy too. You are as well, and I'm obsessed with pushing the envelope of what a score can do to a movie. Music and film can go hand in hand and do something unique and different, and that's why I love Ludwig. I think the guy's like a genius, and I think Göransson, and the fact that he's bringing in, like, let's bring in 808s to a score, bro.
Right.
Let's bring in fucking hip-hop to a score. Like, that shit is what gets me excited. And the fact that that's the innovative kind of stuff that Blade Runner did back in 82, and the fact that we're seeing that now, bringing back the synth, bringing back whatever it is, in a ton of major blockbuster movies and smaller movies. What do you guys think about that? Just the impact of this score, because it was so good. I'll start with you, man.
Yeah, no, I love the score. I mean, I think the score is a perfect mixture of the jazzy kind of
melancholy,
the noir kind of set background music mixed with the synthesizers to give it like that extra sci-fi feel and vibe to it. I think it's the perfect blend. I honestly think, and you know, like we talked about, like I just said, Ridley Scott being from music videos, he has a good ear for detecting what right score pieces are set in the right places, because it's, as important as score is, also the places without score where it means the most. And the whole moment leading up to the ending with the tears in the rain scene, and right when the music comes in right at the perfect moment towards the end of that, I heard it was mostly improvised monologue.
Yeah, Rutger Hauer actually changed the script that he had gotten, so that part, and I guess apparently that when they shot that scene, that the entire crew started crying.
Really?
Because it was so impactful to them, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense because I cry every freaking time I see
Exactly,
that.
exactly. But then the use of the music in that scene, like the way it comes in on just the perfect note, and even even cutting to the slow motion doves as they fly off, just to give it that extra level of like grandiose presentation is amazing to me. So
off the top, I forget the name of the composer. Do you guys?
Vangelis.
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought I was like a Blade Runner. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess we called him Vangelis in
yeah.
but I think he's a genius, and it's completely true, which is why it's my favorite score because it's so groundbreaking. Mm-hmm. And we have bands from like the 70s, 80s, like Kraftwerk, like bands that were kind of started this whole synth craze, and probably bands like Daft Punk, who have also composed great scores for Tron Legacy, that definitely have had the influence of these older bands. But I feel like Vangelis did something crazy with this, because most scores back in the day, we all agreed that Star Wars is not the movie that it is without John Williams' score. John Williams is a genius. Like, there's so many composers that bring a completely different level to the movie, that elevate the movie, right? And Vangelis not only did this with Blade Runner, but he did it in a way where he didn't have a bunch of different like leitmotifs or very what's it called, like themes, right? That we can all hum, right? Like, it's not very radio friendly if you put on the Blade Runner score. But I think that's what makes it sci-fi. That's what makes and not only that, not only the instruments that he used, but he mixed synthesizers with world music instruments, and with some of the choral stuff that you hear, like you hear women singing. That totally transports you to thinking, this is LA, but it's an alternate reality that I don't belong to, but I believe that it exists. Right. And another thing that I think is genius in the movie is that there's several scenes where this happens, but one of them is when Deckard and Rachel are in his apartment, and that whole weird like rapey scene happens. They play my favorite track from the score, which is the love theme. Yes, and that's where you hear the saxophone and the beautiful piano. But at the same time, there's a scene where Rachel's actually playing the piano. Right? And so I thought it was really crazy that they were able to have her play the piano at the same time that you hear the score. That's not very easy to do. So I was immediately impressed by things like that. So,
as going back to that, it's very, with the whole idea of themes and leitmotifs, like, it's very easy to have a traditional classical Hollywood interpretation of a score and composition, but because Vangelis wasn't like a composer, he was a regular musician, if I'm not mistaken, but he didn't compose a lot of films, but you could tell that angle of originality, being unbound to the conventions of being a traditional composer, really allow for the freedom and creativity for this.
Right. And it's funny that I think he won an Oscar for Chariots of Fire, which is a very like melodic, easy to remember theme.
Dun, 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 dun.
It's been used in like Friends, right? It's been used in every single thing out there, pop culture wise. But Blade Runner to me is just on another level.
Yeah. What do you think? How do you think scores can influence a movie and impact your emotions on a movie, Sabrina?
Well, definitely there's a ton of examples of really good ones, like even with just Marriage Story, the way they did the score in that one throughout, like it's so good. It just captures your emotions so well. But with something like this, I think it just kind of adds to the world building again.
Yes.
Where you feel that like dystopian, like futuristic, just by the way it sounds, you're in. Like the visuals, the sound together,
Absolutely. Yeah. Can I say something? One of the things the score does, and it adds to the entire narrative of this movie, is the fact that it's a very contemplative score, if that makes sense. It feels like you're in this...
Like you could meditate to it?
Exactly. Yeah. Like you can think on it, meditate on it. And that leads me to the pacing of this movie.
Look at the transition.
I mean, the fact that this movie is notoriously, and I mean notoriously, not liked by some that feel like it's too slow, too contemplative, too melancholy, too like let's pick things up, let's get things moving.
It's so perfect.
And that's not what Ridley Scott wanted. He wanted to have a much more thinking piece, kind of world building, slow world building, like he's opening up this world piece by piece rather than just an explosion, an action scene, and some speeder chase. He really wanted you to feel that. What do you guys feel like rewatching this movie, and how do you guys feel if that's a fair criticism when it comes to this movie, when it comes to the first Blade Runner? Because obviously we'll get to 2049 of the pacing not being the most exciting thing in the world.
I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because people always say, oh, like we've had callers on Caller Live be like, oh, like what's a movie that that you love that when you show it to people they hate it? And I'm like, my favorite movie.
Right.
People just fall asleep. They think it's boring. They think it's too slow. They don't think anything's happening. But I think the pace specifically of the movie makes you believe that in the reality of the world, right? Like the fact that just that beautiful shot of Tyrell's, home or office or whatever, where you first meet Rachel and Deckard comes in and you have this like crazy big window with the Tyrell Corporation in the background, and then you see the owl. Like the whole, like I feel like Ridley was thinking about all these things and being like, it's kind of like reading Tolkien, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's so descriptive visually, but that's what makes you immerse yourself in the world.
Yeah.
I think the details of, like you said, the visual storytelling, from the production design to the composition of these elaborate shots showing you these small people in this gigantic world. I think that's a big part of why, usually when you have shots that are bigger or longer or that that are less cutty, and even just bigger in terms of composition, bigger in frame, audiences receive that as slower pacing because it's not as energetic as like a moving action shot or something like that. But I think what's beautiful about this movie is that it, to me, I don't think it feels slow for me personally.
No.
But I guess I connect a lot more to the material.
Sure.
But also too, it moves pretty much at the same pace as like any other old school noir detective movie too. Like it does, the structure is quite loose and kind of fast. I mean, we follow entire sub-stories and subplots of characters in Blade Runner who really, essentially doesn't add up to much. I mean, was that Phoebe? Am I saying Phoebes or Cakes or one of the character who is killed by Daryl Hannah?
Oh, yeah. By Pris.
Yeah.
Sebastian?
Sebastian, yeah.
You're talking about the guy that helps make the replicants? Because she doesn't kill Sebastian.
Oh, no. I might
Sebastian's the one that like she finds outside the movie theater and goes into the Bradbury building, the apartment.
That's it. Yeah. We follow storylines that in the moment doesn't really seem like it's adding up to much, but it's to emphasize the greater themes that the movie's communicating.
Right.
So to me, it just goes to show like it's a very. It's not a conventional structure. It's not a conventional pace, but I think it adds to the level of suspense and the mystery behind this whole story. And
the level of like believing that it's a sci-fi world. Like that's what it is. That's what it is to me. And like really quick to add to that, I also feel like it's. I don't think the pace is slow to me, but that's because just the beginning shots of Rick and Gaff in the spinner and just like driving or flying through LA and all those beautiful shots that are clearly Attack of the Clones ripped off to piss all the people off that love the prequels and know I hate them.
Or homage.
Yeah. Sure.
Yes.
Sorry, guys. But not sorry. No, but there's nothing going on in those scenes except what you're seeing with your eyes and what you're hearing score-wise, right? There's no like Captain America throwing a pun at like Iron Man, right? And I think that's why people get bored. Well, I think that's what it is, because you're just watching and hearing something, but there's no dialogue happening.
And to come back to that, to be fair, that wasn't a popular movie, man. This didn't make a lot of money. And Ridley Scott
understand it.
Notoriously has always talked about this movie and how he's like, yeah, everyone likes it now, but man, this thing, people kill me for this shit. Like they went at him because he basically burned through cash. Because he the budget wasn't small. And the fact that this movie is lived on through this weird kind of film lover community, and yet people who go back and rewatch it, most people, obviously, like generations now, don't come back and say, oh yeah, that was incredible. They go back and be like, well, I don't know what the hype is about. Most people still don't. What do you think that is? They still don't connect to this movie in a way that they connect to other older movies, maybe like The Shining, for example. Because going back and rewatching The Shining or going back and rewatching other movies that are older, classic, legendary movies, and people are like, yo, that shit was dope, versus Blade Runner, and they're like, man, this is slow, this sucks. Like, they don't feel that connection that other communities or film lover communities have to it.
Can I
What do you think that is?
Really quick? I think it's what I first said about why I ended up loving this movie, and I think it's because people don't understand. They think that Rick Deckard's the hero, and he's not a great person. He's depressed the whole time, right? Like, it's not somebody that you root for, so they don't know who to relate to, and they don't understand that, or maybe they're not empathizing with Roy and Pris and all the replicants, that all they're asking for is more life,
freedom,
right? So if you relate to them, if you relate to these characters, you understand, yeah, it fucking sucks. Like, we're already pissed that we're gonna die, hopefully at like 90, right?
Yeah.
Let alone imagine, oh, you're created now and you're only living 4 years. I'd be pissed. You know what I mean? So maybe it's that.
Yeah, and can I go off that and say that's where this movie starts. Finally, we get that opening text and opening crawl, which essentially says early 21st century. Obviously, 2019. Shout out to 2019.
Yeah.
November. This is where
go.
living in,
I
you
was gonna
guys.
say perfect time.
It's never happening again.
I
We're
know.
literally living in Blade Runner month.
That's crazy. But basically, the idea of the creation of these beings, these replicants, that the Nexus 6.
We're Mexis 6.
Oh, there you go. Of course we are.
That's good.
But it's this idea that the reason why they're created in the first place, and this goes back to a lot of media. A lot of media does this, and obviously modern media does this, and current media does this. The idea of creating a being, whether it's androids, whether it's clones, whatever kind of being, in order for humanity to kind of wash their hands clean of dehumanizing, because humanity is so obsessed with superiority in class, in life, and whatever it is, that they want to bring down whatever they can. And most of the time it's on race, right? They usually close out on a race and say, this race is superior to us, therefore we must suppress it. Now in this world, they're saying we've created a new race of beings so that we can suppress, because literally the opening text says, these replicants are used for slave labor, military operations, and like off-world exploration where they're probably going to die because the humans don't want to do that. And they can say, we're not killing people, we're just killing robots. And it's that idea of robots are actually people too. And we're still...
What's the meaning of life? Like, how can you...
Exactly.
Or what makes somebody or something human?
What makes them human? And the fact that we're washing our hands clean of killing off these beings instead of realizing that they're actually human beings and we're still the same perverted, destructive race that we've always have been, repeating the same mistakes and using scapegoats and excuses to kind of use these people as slaves and military operations and explorers that are just probably going to get blown away. Pleasure models. That's kind of the idea, and that's kind of the world that they've created. And obviously we see a ton of that now with Westworld, with, I mean, obviously all the Ridley Scott content we see as well. Ex Machina. But it's this idea of humanity wanting to suppress other people and wanting to rise above in class, because at the end of the day, this movie, without being so on the nose, is about class, and it's about class structure, and it's about hierarchy, and it's about how the people at the top are always going to find a way. Literally at the top of a pyramid.
No, and I think that's a really pretty looking pyramid.
Yeah, and I was going to say it's beautiful, and the way they do it is really smart, because you see the street level with Deckard, and you see what it looks like, and you're like, damn, that's crazy. And you see the pristine, and you see the beautiful. How they find ways to still close up their walls, to wash their hands clean, and suppress whatever creature, being, person, race that they can find. That is kind of the overlying theme inside this sci-fi world, and I think that's completely fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's the you're right that that's the theme as to like what the world is, but I think also to add to that are the philosophical themes that I love so much about this movie. And then you do see like Roy Batty himself is, the smartest replicant they've created, right? Like he's on another level, and I think him and Tyrell have a conversation about how he's basically like he I forget what exactly the line is, but Tyrell tells him that like you've been created and you've done amazing things because of who you are, and Roy's not satisfied with that, right? And which I feel like is he wants more life. Right, that's what he wants, and that we can all relate to that, right? Regardless of our class, right? Regardless of where we are in the world, we all are constantly, whether we like it or not, dealing with the fact that we're mortal, right? And I think that that's something that's why this movie, that's why I'm so obsessed with it, because you can understand that all the characters are dealing with that. And even Gaff at the end, when he's talking to Rick about Rachel, he's like, what's that great line where he's like, it's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does?
Yeah.
That's a huge thing to add to the way that humans want to control other humans.
Yeah.
But that's because we can't control our own mortality.
Yeah. Right. And sorry, go ahead, Sabrina.
Oh, no. Well, that's something I wanted to add. Like when they use the term retiring with that mortality, it's interesting that they use that rather than like killing.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's like almost, I don't know.
Yeah.
It goes back to the idea of like them kind of washing their hands. Like we're not really killing.
Right.
It's not killing if they're not human. And that idea of like being a morally superior person, because as you rise up in this class structure, the rich always find a way to wash their hands in this highbrow moral way where they want to be rich and powerful and step on everyone, but they don't want to be like, oh, I don't want to be seen to step on everyone. I still want to find a way to seem like I'm giving and I'm moral. And that's another way to do it. It's this world that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's all about, the idea of class and structure, and particularly how we see even at the bottom level, even while the replicants are still the lowest, seemingly of this society, we still see the ground level where Rick Decker's like interacting with, surrounded by a lot of Chinese people and a very Chinese influenced Los Angeles that is implying this sort of like this sort of difference, another hierarchy in that class, right? Even though there's a bottom tier of the replicants, there is still bottom tiers of human life too, and there's still tiers that are building on top of human society too. So it's still the same problems we're dealing with. It's just with the added issue of morality and artificial intelligence, and morality and creating life. Yeah. And I think, I know you're a big religious guy, Ace, and this movie, along with all of Ridley Scott's filmography, deals a lot with the idea of religion and creation and the creator who creates you.
Like the God concept, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like this movie dives so deep into that. That's why I really think the whole class hierarchy structure really derives from, is that it's really Scott's questioning of what is the hierarchy, who is our creator, and with rich people with the super high wealthy class being the creator of these robots, they're reasserting their God complex, and taking that life away from them is another reassertion of that.
Which is another, which is really quick, which is another, it's basically what I was talking about earlier, where it's like, it's another form of people thinking that they have some form of control. And we saw Ridley Scott do it, we've seen him do it in other movies, obviously, like Prometheus,
That's what I was gonna say.
right? Like that's something that, like finding or seeking who our creators are, right? Like Roy goes to Tyrell, right? But like Tyrell, he has all this power, he has the prestige or whatever to do these things, and these people kind of become, I don't know if mad with power, but then that's why they end up doing crazy things like that, because they feel like, oh yeah, this is they don't see themselves as human anymore. They see themselves as, like you said, like the God complex.
Yeah.
And that's exactly who Tyrell is.
And we see that, I was going to say that, this is coming back from Wayland, right? Back in Alien. And Alien kind of started this concept of the idea of, in the future, who is king, who is God? and it's corporations. That's what it is. Whether it's the Wayland Corporation, Wayland Yutani, or the Terrell Corporation.
Mickey Mouse.
It's in 100 years, give it, well, maybe 10 years.
Yeah, 20.
But either way, it's this idea that corporations have their own structure, their own morality, their own idea of what the rules that they live by is. And it's them deciding who is allowed to do whatever it is they want to do. And it's funny because this movie kind of builds off that in a very organic visual way, and that's the ads. The hologram ads is kind of the biggest gift that this movie has given us because we see that obviously Minority Report, which is another
Philip K. Dick
cyberpunk kind of adaptation. And it's that idea of like in a world 50 years from now or now, because this is taking place now, the world is going to be consumed with advertisements and ads and just trying to sell you whatever it is they're trying to sell you.
I mean, our anytime we're surfing the internet, it's like buy this, buy
Instagram.
this. I used to work for Google, man. Like that was my job. Literally,
it's all about selling ads. That's how people make money nowadays, and it's that idea of now. What is a big topic right now in Congress? Data, right? Private
Data
information.
Mining.
Data mining.
How can I speak on the phone with somebody about something I see an Instagram ad for 2 minutes later?
Exactly.
What's that?
Stuff like that. And it's one of those things where that's an actual thing because the reason why people are trying to protect their privacy and their information and their data isn't because of some weird like government conspiracy to like, I don't know, clone them or something. It's because of ads.
No, I'm kidding.
It's because of ads. It's because targeted ads are the biggest commodity in the world right now. And that comes from Ridley Scott, bro. I mean, he said it in Blade Runner, which I think is so cool. The fact that this is the world that we're living in a much more specific manner, obviously now, than this overt manner in a visual way in Blade Runner. But I just find that to be fascinating because
especially someone who comes from making ads, who made commercials, who made over 3,000 commercials.
Oh yeah, 100%, Ridley Scott, and it's one of those ideas of like this is the world that we're gonna live in.
And also to add to that, it's this thing. I mean, consumerism in general, right? Like that's kind of how the lower classes, I think, are controlled, right? Like it's kind of crazy to think about. That's why I love all of these like sort of dystopian stories because I am that type of person that like never liked shopping and never was into, I got to get the latest iPhone. Like it's just things to me.
Right.
But the constant advertising, the constant marketing is everywhere. That it's like a family that's barely supporting themselves has to have the latest gadget, right? And that's crazy, but that's this. I don't know if it's intentional manipulation. I don't know if it's I'm being too like conspiracy theorist here.
It's very intentional.
But it is a way to control the human race, right? And to be like, let's distract you with this shiny thing, so you don't think about the fact that your healthcare sucks, or you know what I mean. Like that's been most sci-fi stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to jump to a little bit more of this themes in the movie, talking about humanity and talking about that's kind of the central theme too. Is like what makes you a human? What is a soul? And obviously, Ghost in the Shell gets into that a little bit more. And this movie really dives into memories and the idea, and obviously 2049 does as well. But it's the idea of having memories and being an actual being and living. What does that mean? And what constitutes yourself as being a human being and being a person? What do you guys? I know that's a very deep, profound question.
No, that's literally why I love this movie.
But that's exactly. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So the biggest, I think, human character development in the movie is Roy Batty, because at first you're like, this is Rutger Hauer is at first really terrifying, right? Like he's amazing in this movie, and you think when you first see him, this is the replicant that Deckard has to find, and he is the villain in the story. But that whole end scene where he's chasing him in the Bradbury building, and he ends up not killing him, right? Like he doesn't, spoilers, he doesn't let go of him, and he actually saves him and picks him up.
Right.
And I feel like that's when Roy realized that's what it is to be human, right? Like I'm fighting so much for my life, and I want to continue living, and I'm pissed off that I only have this lifespan.
Yeah.
But in order to really be human, I have to show some form of compassion or kindness to the other.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's in that moment he teaches Deckard, that maybe Deckard is actually, you see it in Harrison Ford's face when Roy is giving him that monologue. Rick's character actually looks kind of shocked, and I think that's him realizing I'm an asshole, right? That's him realizing this replicant that I'm supposed to hunt down is more human than all of us who are trying to kill other replicants, right? Like that's the biggest, I think, point of the whole movie.
Like the reveal, yeah.
Right, because that is what makes us human, right? Like, and also to touch on Rachel, because she's such a relevant character to the story as well. Because imagine, having all these memories in your hard drive and then being told that they're not real. I mean, that's gotta be horrifying, right? I'm still waiting for that. I'm like, who's gonna tell me this is like the Truman Show or something, right? And so that's another thing too, where it's like, do memories, do things that happen to you in life that you appreciate, that's what makes you human? Or is it how you treat others, right? There's all of these different things, because she also was a very kind replicant, right? She was a kind person no matter what. And I don't know if that's because of the memories that were installed in her, or if it's just because of whatever her genetic makeup was, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what's fascinating about it too. It's like, can you choose as a replicant or a human to be
choice,
a good
right?
person, right?
Choice.
And Roy chose that.
Yeah.
Roy chose to not kill Deckard.
And that's the idea of what makes us human is our choices, is our decisions. That's the greatest gift that God gave to mankind is free will, right? It's the idea of choosing who you are as an identity. And I love that. And can we just jump straight to that speech? The fact that he saved him, I always say he saved him so he can give him that damn speech. He's like, bro, I got a good speech. Hold up. I'm going to put you right back here. And that speech is incredible. And the reason why it's incredible.
That's the one thing, a piece of dialogue in a movie that I remember.
Yeah, and part of it is because of what he says, and this is what I find to be so fascinating, is that idea of we're using these beings to just be like cannon fodder, like straight up just toss them out into the world and see what we find, and in reality, what they're finding is something obviously horrific, but at the same time kind of fucking incredible, and the fact that Roy Batty is like, bro, I've seen fucking spaceships zoom out of the sky. Like, you haven't seen the shit I've seen.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
And it's one of those things where it's like, you imagine being a human being and missing out on that shit. Like, part of it is like horrific. You're like, fuck, that sucks, man. But at the same time, you're like, man, I want to see those shit too. Like, space exploration is part of what the Nexus 6 does. And it's that idea of like, living is actually what Roy Batty has been doing this whole time, where those people on Earth have been just dying and rotting.
That's what I was gonna.
Attack ships on fire on the shoulder of Orion.
Yeah,
that's
I watch
exactly.
C-beams. I'm sorry.
No, give us that monologue, because you're right. Because it's brilliant, because it shows that replicants are actually living more life because
in
of
their shorter lifespan. They're living way more than humans on Earth,
and because the corporations of keeping the humans on Earth down to the levels of like the Rick Deckers and all of the people in the Los Angeles area.
Totally, and Rick is just kind of depressed in his apartment, not doing anything, not living his life, even though he's being given the gift of living, way longer, like for decades, hopefully, and he's not doing anything with it. And a lot of us are guilty of that.
Absolutely, and one of the things that this movie does so well, and a lot of sci-fi does this, obviously, we saw Alita Battle Angel do this as well. It's this idea of creating these androids specifically for certain purposes, and the purpose of Roy Batty is he's a military leader. Like, that's the first thing he is. And the irony, and obviously Ridley Scott does this in a lot of his movies, pretty much all his movies, and that's why maybe I'm just the biggest Alien fan, even current Alien movies, because he takes those concepts and he says, what happens when someone who plays God and their creation turns on them? What happens when you make the perfect military weapon, Roy Batty. And all of a sudden, he's like, fuck you, bro. And he comes right back at you. You're just like, yo. And that's obviously what happens to Terrell. He gets his freaking brain squashed in and his eyes gouged out.
Great scene.
Yeah, great scene.
And
Great
it's
scene.
one of those ideas of like, my creation is coming back to bite me in the ass. And that idea, obviously, Westworld is another example that literally does this last season. That kind of concept is so cool because it's the comeuppance, right? It's the idea of like you get what you deserve, you're getting justice. This is the justice you got. You playing God has now led you to having this destruction, and that's something that Homeboy did in Jurassic Park, the book, the novel. The idea of him playing God and him realizing like, oh shit, now I'm getting eaten by these dinosaurs because I tried to commodify it and make money off of this shit. And me playing God is all of a sudden me getting my ass eaten in Jurassic Park. You
Should
know,
have stuck to Pirates of the Caribbean.
there you go. And it's,
like Malcolm.
and that same guy wrote Westworld, and it's
Right.
that
Michael
it's the
Crichton.
same. That's his name, Michael Crichton. And it's that same concept of like man plays God and demons come out, and that's why, like you
Women
said,
inherits the earth.
there you go. But it's that idea of like what you said, right? Where Ridley Scott is obsessed with this idea of God and man, and that's something that I'm obsessed with too. And the idea of who is Satan, who is Lucifer, who is the devil, who is demons. It's this idea of creation kind of coming back to God in
Right.
this haunting form.
Not only that, I think, moreover, I think what, a lot of people who aren't religious can also read into this movie and say that the deeper religious, because I read a lot of religious interpretations of this movie, the deeper secular interpretation of this is that, as a lot of times, let me backtrack a little bit. A lot of times, a lot of secular people argue that Christianity, the belief in a heaven and a hell is less about an actual physical afterlife, but more about the memory that you leave in somebody's mind. So you're going to heaven, you're ascending upwards because you, because you left a good memory in people's mind. People remember you as a good person. And you go to hell in people's minds because you are a bad person and people want to remember you rotting and burning in fire. So then this movie kind of...
I grew up Catholic, so I actually was taught that you will burn in hell.
Yeah. No, but I'm Christian too, though. But I'm Christian too,
get
so I that's an interpretation that whatever.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying. So, but from a secular perspective, that's how they look at it. So if you look at Blade Runner from that angle, from like a more secular angle, it's about how you going back to the idea of choice. You can choose to leave a good legacy. If you're a human, if you're a replicant, it doesn't even matter. It's why the whole debate of whether or not Rick Deckard is a replicant or not, honestly, is not really a question that I want to see answered. Or let's be clear, they do answer that question.
I was going to say, they kind of answer it.
In the
final cut.
Yeah.
They answer in the final cut. But the idea that it doesn't matter if you're actually born a human or you absorb life. It's the memories that you leave. It's the impact that you make on the world that's more important.
Yeah, and that's Roy Batty's character, right? And what's interesting is because the religion thing is interesting because I grew up religious and I'm no longer religious, but I went from like Catholic to Christian to trying all these religions to going like the really nihilistic atheist asshole route of like I'm right and you guys don't know anything who are religious, and now I'm just like a goth hippie. I'm just like I don't know what's real. But what I do think is, I don't think you need religion to be a good moral person, right? I think that whatever you, whether you're into philosophy, like whatever you put your faith in to continue surviving and hopefully showing kindness and compassion to others, I think is what's important. But what's interesting that we're talking about, like God, whether it's God or the universe or whatever created us, and we're seeing all these themes in these movies. It's kind of crazy to also think how we've evolved as a human race, and that whole conflict that you were talking about earlier of like, okay, well now we created birth control, so we can just have sex without procreating, right? Like we created medicine, we created all these things that are kind of fighting whatever our origin was. That like it's not like we used to die and the human race used to not live as long as and we're probably going to prolong life as we continue unless some crazy Mad Max apocalypse happens, right? So that's also fascinating to think about that and how this movie from like the 1980s touches on those topics so well, right?
Absolutely, and there's still an interpretation to be said, and obviously maybe because I lean towards the religious route, of Roy Batty kind of amplifying that Christ figure of him being the one where he's not only not the enemy, everyone else, Earth is hell, and he's trying to escape hell, and he's trying to lead a revolution, saving his people, which is the Nexus 6, which is these android beings, and lead them out of, destruction into a better life, into a better world, into actually being humans against the oppressive human corporations and human life and human existence.
Human dictators.
Human dictators who are putting this on them. And that idea of him actually representing this revolutionary religious figure because he's leading his people towards freedom and towards life and towards something that every human being wants and he's not allowed to have. And he feels like that's not right. And that's literally, and I mean literally, the conception of Christ and how Christ in the Bible came and in real life came during these political times of people being oppressed and how fighting oppression is always going to be the Christ-like way, in my opinion, because that's what true Christianity is and what truly Christ represents is the idea of fighting against an oppressive government, an oppressive being, a foot that's trying to step on you and say you're a less being, you're an inferior being, and that's what Roy Batty's fighting against. I just was like, that's deep, man.
So that's like what you're saying is Jesus is not a capitalist?
No, absolutely not. I have some hot takes.
No, and that's what. And again,
I think fighting oppression is the biggest theme of Ridley Scott's movies, whether it's Gladiator, whether it's Alien, whether it's Prometheus, whether it's. I think that to me is the biggest example of what a human is. A human is showing kindness, showing love, not just to the people that look like me and the people that I deem to be human, but people that I can have to start to question, like they're human too.
Right.
I have to realize like it's not just my race, my identity, my world.
My religion.
Yeah. It's everyone. And that includes people like the Nexus 6 and Roy Batty. And that's the metaphor that is used a lot in sci-fi of using these other beings for examples of different types of beings in this world that we identify as our own and we say, me and my own, and that's it. Where in reality, if we start to expand our horizons, we start to realize that is life, that is love, that is true, spiritualness, whatever you want to call it, is finding that connection with other people. That is true life.
Right, and it's finding it's that interesting. And I touched upon it earlier of like, yes, I was super nihilistic and like kind of pessimistic about life and being like it's pointless. Now that I'm no longer a believer in a religion, I lost my faith. I just lost my faith in general in believing anything. Right, and so I feel like eventually I remember that I grew up on Mr. Rogers and I'm just gonna make my own goal in life is gonna be to do this, right, to be a good person, no matter what's real out there, no matter how I end up. But it's kind of trying to figure out how to live in peace together because we're all stuck here with each other, right? And it's interesting. The first character I thought of when you were talking about like Roy Batty and kind of trying to save his people was Magneto, right? Because that's another character that I grew up fascinated with.
Me too. I love him. He's my favorite Marvel villain.
Yeah, same. And so it's interesting that we have all these kind of antagonistic characters, but most of them are just trying to survive, and whether they make choices and they do it in the way that's not the moral way, but that's usually their goal is to survive themselves and to have their people survive.
Absolutely.
Right?
And that's what's great about art is the idea of creating metaphors and creating things that look like our world and look like our life, and we start to extend those thoughts and say, wait a minute, that's happening now and that's happening around my life right now. Revolution, fighting against oppression, fighting against dictatorship, fighting against racism, fighting against all this kind of stuff is the kind of world that we should want to promote. We should want to promote that stuff because that's what humanity should be about, and that's the kind of stuff that Blade Runner, that comic books, whatever it is, whatever art medium you want to consume, can represent.
Absolutely. Sabrina, what are your thoughts on
I was
religion?
Gonna say, I'm talking. No, not necessarily religion. I'm not talking about religion.
Do you believe in God, Sabrina?
I'm on the spot.
Just about like the idea of everything that he's putting into this movie. What do you think of that?
I think he just sends a really beautiful message in this film, and I think that's something that we take away from all of that with the humanity, with treating others with like kindness. It doesn't matter what like level you're on, because we see it from this other point of view. We're obviously like an objective point of view where we're seeing them on the same level. So that's why where we grow up and we see Harrison Ford as like the hero. And then we later on we're seeing this other side, and then we're caught between this kind of like conflict of like who is actually really right. You know? So I think coming out of that, I don't know, it's a really important message. I think it's a really special part of the film.
Yes.
Saying so much without beating it over our heads.
Sure.
Which is a term we've been talking about a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and unlike really quick, and unlike other sci-fi movies, like one of my other favorite sci-fi movies, the classic 2001, Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
You know, they created the machine, right? HAL 9000, and obviously he became, or he or it or she or whatever became a threat, and that's why eventually, you know, Dave destroys it. Right, but that's a different concept of like, okay, this whatever I've created is actually is dangerous to me and might end my life, right? So that's another concept there where you're right. Like a lot of, I'm sure Rick and the other, or Deckard or the other Blade Runners or cops, like some of them don't care and don't respect any replicant life, but some of them are also worried that they might come after them, right? So there's that interesting concept too, where like you can empathize with all the characters a little bit. Even though the one I empathize with the most is Roy.
Yeah. And just going back real quick to the idea of the noir film, right? The original noir film was created to have this kind of black and white, kind of strict viewpoint of the world. That's very much there's a good guy and there's a bad guy, and that's it. And the good guy is always going to find a bad guy at the end. But the traits of neo-noir, which I think Blade Runner executes perfectly, is the idea of the good guy maybe is not the good guy who we anticipate. The bad guy maybe isn't the bad guy. Maybe there's a deeper evil, there's a deeper corruption that lies within our society that is the true evil. That is really the evil behind the situation. We see movies like Chinatown deal with that. We see movies like a lot of other noir movies from the 70s, neo-noir movies from the 70s, 80s. Most recently, Nightcrawler is another example of that deals with that concept as well. The idea that society is doing the corrupting more. Taxi Driver, we were just talking about before the show. The idea of there's a system that's doing more of the corrupting than the actual good guy or bad guy. So,
yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, we're going to take a break, and then after the break, we're going to be talking about Blade Runner 2049, the sequel to this one. So make sure you guys stick around. Ooh.
This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. With the 4/5 divide you in half. You getting at me equals a club laugh. You do the math, take you out the equation.
The following is from RB3's review of Knives Out. Enjoy. Seeing it twice, I went looking for specific moments to really catch on, and a lot of stuff added up to a lot of good stuff. There's a couple of tiny loose threads that I was able to detect, but it's such a non-issue.
So it's a kind of movie that you want to go back and rewatch.
Yes, you'd want to go back and rewatch it.
To kind of see where the mystery leads.
Yeah.
That's really cool, man.
It's really fun. And again, if you love stuff like James, I love Sherlock Holmes. I told you Sherlock is one of my favorite shows. And the movies with Robert Downey Jr. are amazing. And I've read a couple of the books. And if you are looking for a modernized American, kind of politically driven Sherlock Holmes story, this is the movie for that. Because it is so it's
all right. You got me. That's a good sell. That's a
Yeah.
good sell, man. Because I love Sherlock Holmes. You know me.
Yeah.
Alrighty. I guess that those are the closing thoughts on Go See Knives Out.
Go see Knives Out. Highest recommendations, y'all.
Really interesting.
Come along, children. Now we're going to have a little music.
What is up, guys? We're back talking about Blade Runner. Now we're going to get into Blade Runner 2049. This movie came out in 2016, 2017?
No, it's 17.
2017.
Damn, I'm
This
old.
movie came out in 2017. Notoriously was like a $300 million movie and made like no money in the theater. This movie bombed pretty bad.
It's very sad.
It's pretty sad, yeah, actually. And it's directed by a director that we love. And we did an episode on Denis Villeneuve.
It was our first episode, wasn't it?
No, he was like our third.
Second, yeah.
First was Darren Aronofsky.
That's right.
I cannot wait for Dune, man.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Super excited for that.
So obviously we've talked about Prisoners, we've talked about Incendies. I think this guy's a literal genius.
Yeah.
And Enemy is another movie we've talked about quite a bit. 2049 was this interesting follow-up because it goes back to my first part of this conversation where it's like, if you really, really think about it, not a lot of people are fans of this movie. And you saw that with the kind of, turnout for 2049. Not a lot of people went to see it because not a lot of people were fans of it or had seen the first one.
Right.
Because if a lot of people have seen the first one, they'd at least check out this one. This movie is regarded by many, and by many I say a lot of critics and a lot of writers, as one of the best follow-up sequels in a while, and a really good adaptation of an original material, and paying honor and tribute and homage to that, because so much of nowadays RB3, Dorina, Sabrina, is being having trepidation towards adapting what's considered to be legendary, classic, perfect cinema, whether it's The Shining, whether it's Blade Runner, whether it's whatever it is that people are saying, don't touch that, don't touch that, don't touch that, because old people love their old shit.
We do.
Yeah, but I always feel like let's spark some shit up, bro. If you're inspired by something, fucking do it, and you can make some good shit. And I think Blade Runner 2049 is a good example of it, because I think this is some quality stuff. Because I feel like it obviously, I've heard your points and you're right. It doesn't exactly break the barrier with something so groundbreaking like the first movie did. It doesn't. What it does is it pays homage to it. It pays tribute to it in this interesting metaphorical fashion of taking Ryan Gosling's character,
Kay, yeah,
and that's his name, and giving him a different perspective and a different role. I want to hear your guys' thoughts. I'll start with you, Sabrina, because I'm curious. Did you see? You've seen Blade Runner 2049, right?
Yeah, I
saw it. What do you think about this movie?
In theaters, I thought it was just the visuals were really, really nice.
We'll get to that, but I think this is one of the most beautiful movies ever.
Yeah, no.
I was like, do people disagree?
Oh,
That's what I was
yeah,
saying.
No. I
So-
think this is one of the most. I'm talking ever.
Yeah,
but
agreed.
I'm
we'll
really
get to
happy
that.
I saw it on screen purely for that, definitely. I thought it was a little bit slow, but but not too bad. I think it definitely did it justice. Talking about the sequels, I think it's definitely like a really good sequel to something that's considered like, at this point, like kind of like classic, iconic. And basically, I think it did it justice.
You just think it's a little slow, a little dry?
A little bit slow. That's why I haven't really revisited it. I did once. I did once before. I tried to today. I wanted to get through it.
It's one of those things. I went with my brother, who's not a Blade Runner fan, who's not a cinema fan. He's like a big MCU fan and DCU fan. He loves comic book movies like I do. And he was also like in the same boat. He's like, bro, some really good acting, but damn, this thing was slow. Damn, this thing was long. Like, he just felt like it was so long and so drawn out. And a lot of people had that idea of just being a really tedious, kind of overdrawn movie. I think there's a famous video, I think it's on YouTube, of this guy who went through one scene where he's just walking, and it's like 8 minutes of him walking. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, RB3, but I just think that's so funny. But yeah, I'm so curious to hear your thoughts, because you're a hardcore Blade Runner fan, and we just talked about it. I already know his thoughts, but I'm curious to hear yours, Dorina.
So, this movie, when it was announced first, I'm immediately like putting on my nerd hat. And I'm like, why?
You're like,
man,
no, you can't touch it.
Fucking loser nerd that I was. I still am. But I didn't know what to expect when I saw who was attached to it, especially Deakins, who's a genius. I was like, you know what? At least it'll look good.
Right. Trailers look good.
Exactly. The score will be good. I was worried because a lot of these reboots have become,
Cash grabs?
Thank you. Yes, I was looking exactly for that term. Cash grabs. Even, I know people love Force Awakens, but it's basically A New Hope, like at least half of the movie. It's kind of the same thing that we've seen. Right?
Hot takes, but yes.
Yeah, but so anyway, but you guys do agree that a lot of these reboots, similar to like Stranger Things, like so fun, but if E.T. didn't exist, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So I like them. I enjoy all these reboots, but there hasn't been one that like has grabbed me that I'm like, this is an amazing sequel.
Mm-hmm.
So as just looking at it as from like a sequel, I think it's a good sequel.
Yes.
Right. As a big Blade Runner fan, I had a lot of issues with the story. There's things that I love that I wish were explored more, specifically with just where Kay lived and the fact that he was living in a society where people treated him like, what they call them, the term skin job.
Skin job.
Right. And so that was fascinating to me. But then it also touched on a little bit of nostalgia points where I was like, like I guess is Joy kind of like the Rachel character, even though I love that whole storyline, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was you kind of look like Ana de Armas.
Oh,
Yeah.
shit.
Yeah.
What? Okay, I'll take that.
Shots fired.
Yeah.
Look what we're pulling out. Knives Out. He was on that poster.
Good movie, by the way.
You saw Knives Out?
Since you brought it up, can I just say something, please?
Yes.
Always.
I was gonna say, in the future, if 2049,
Right.
if they really did bring out a Joy,
Yeah.
I was gonna say I think that solved the population problem.
Oh yeah, no, for sure.
That was a great scene, by the way.
Anytime they'd be like, bro, there's too many people on the planet. It's like Joy.
Yeah.
Can
It's
I bring
just-
up something else too?
Yeah.
I saved a picture of her in this
Yeah.
for my bangs. Like I'm getting my bangs cut.
Well, I was gonna say
Yeah.
you have the same haircut. Too.
Yeah.
Are you a hologram?
Yeah.
Are you real or are you a hologram?
I'm not usually here.
No, but anyways, so I again like I thought about like the character of Love. I'm like, she's cool, but is she the Roy Batty, right? I was not a fan of Jared Leto's character.
Oh, really?
I thought he was like this weird like yoga like Mark Zuckerberg. Like I just was not into it at all. I understand what they were trying to do.
Sure.
I just didn't like the way the characters was written.
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
there's things like that. Again, I was bothered by the fact that I love Harrison Ford. I don't think he needed to come back. I would have much rather have them explore what I was talking about, right? Like
Sure.
just that world instead of having to be like, oh, you impregnated Rachel, like those little things. And again, it's me being a nerd, right? It doesn't make it a bad movie. I just wish they had gone a different direction.
Go ahead.
However, as I was watching it visually and being completely consumed by Hans Zimmer and Benjamin Wallfish's score, because I was like, how are they going to do this? How are they going to top Vangelis or at least match him? It doesn't top him for me, but
At least matches?
it's still amazing, and it matches I think visually this movie is groundbreaking. It's one of the most beautiful movies I've seen in years on the big screen. I'm so sad that people didn't watch it because I hope it one day gets re-released because it is just. I mean, I don't know how they did it. It's incredible, and that's the part that made me cry. Like I was like, okay, I don't know if I like this movie, but let's see. And there was a scene where Kay is just on one of the spinners, and you see him going through this. I don't know. It's like a really epic scene where you hear that score, and I literally started like tearing up because I'm like, okay, this movie may not be necessary, and I may not love it as much as the first one, but at least I'm getting that aspect of it. It's groundbreaking in the way that it looks, and the cinematography and the set design. Like it's fucking beautiful.
100. And I'll talk before you real quick. That's all I want to say. Is just my God. Deacons, holy shit! Just give me that
his first
score
Oscar for this movie.
Give me exactly. Give me that score and give me those visuals, and you give me fucking pure cinema,
I get
man.
chills just
like
thinking
that.
about
that
it.
shit is just so beautiful and so gorgeous. And I was just talking to Roka right before we went on,
Right.
and I was talking to him about 1917. I just saw the trailer for that. I hadn't seen the trailer. Just the trailer, y'all. And this is a movie shot by Deakins for anyone who doesn't get what I'm referencing.
Yeah, directed by Sam Mendes.
Directed by Sam Mendes. Just the trailer, and I was like, I was already jumping out of my
Yeah.
seat because I really do feel like cinematography is just as much cinema as storytelling can be. Just
Right.
a pure visual aesthetic can be just as beautiful and just as perfect as any other part of cinema.
Right.
And I feel like adding those two elements of really amazing score and perfect visuals, in my opinion, perfect, can really make a beautiful movie. And just it's on that, it's purely worth it just for me.
Agreed.
And that's kind of my last thoughts, and I'll let you go.
Oh, no. It's good.
Why do you hate this movie?
Do you actually hate it?
RB3.
No, I don't hate it.
Oh,
So
okay.
here's my thing.
But
Like, I don't hate.
You don't hate
this
it. You're
movie,
right. But you talk a lot of shit about it,
No,
bro.
I'm passionate.
I mean,
Here's the thing.
I talk a lot of shit about the prequels, and I don't actually hate them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So here's the thing. Like, I can appreciate Blade Runner 2049 like as a great movie. If somebody says it's a great movie, I'm not going to argue them on it. If somebody says they watched this movie and didn't connect with the original, but they like this one a whole lot, that's cool. Like, I totally get it because it's new, it's fresher, it has a more modern, contemporary voice. Totally get that. I also totally get people put it at their best of the year. It's going to be on a lot of best of the decade list, but it's just not going to be on mine.
Yeah, which we got to do, bro. I mean, we got to speed that up. Best of the decade, man. I just saw one of my favorite podcasts already released it, and I'm like, damn, I want to.
We got to slow down.
But no, bro.
If,
Best
if,
of the decade.
If you ask me personally, we shouldn't put that out till 2023.
No.
But that's a whole different question.
I think we should do it next week.
Well,
all right.
Next week, going to do it next week.
Keep going.
All right, we'll discuss that. Okay, because for me, the thing with Blade Runner 2049 is that it's personal grievances. It's personal shit that I don't like about it. So, like, I can't say that it's a bad movie or it's not a good movie. It's a great movie. It's just something that's not for me. Like you said, the visuals, cinematography, absolutely amazing, mind-blowing stuff. The sound design is absolutely amazing, too. I think to that scene where Kay is getting interrogated before he goes into the police station, it's like a more amplified Von Kemp test, where he's... Von Kemp test, I'm sorry. Where he's...
How dare you not know all the nerdy things?
Yeah, no. You know what's funny? I made a whole joke about Von Kemp back in the Oshmo's No days, and nobody else got it, but whatever. It was on air, too. I feel embarrassed. The thing is, like, but sound design, great. Cinematography, great. Production design, interesting. The editing, that's not it for me.
Oh.
That to me, this movie is abusively long. I think there's a lot of things that is
so you do feel like it is a little long and tedious.
It's not long. It's tedious for this. There's really no motivation for a lot of it. When you look at the original Blade Runner, it has this sort of it is slow and it is slow moving, but there is a lot of life to it. And it's funny because a lot of people criticize Ridley Scott as a filmmaker, saying and a lot of his criticism is that he doesn't know how to bring life to characters. Like, a lot of his characters feel lifeless. A lot of his films feel lifeless, and Blade Runner is the main one that they point to for that. But if this movie, if original Blade Runner is lifeless, this one's like watching a coffin being buried. I mean, goodness gracious, there's entire sequences. Going to the Jared Leto point, there's a whole scene where Jared Leto and I think Ryan Gosling are talking to each other. It's like 10 minutes long, but there's like 5 minutes worth of pauses, like, in between their speech. Like, bruh, there's literally no reason other than the fact to just give you this weird sensation. And to me, I find that really disappointing, particularly because I watched Arrival. Arrival is one of my favorite movies, also by Denis Villeneuve. And that movie is slow and meticulous and slowly paced, and it's like a slow burn too, but it's airtight. Like, it's all for a purpose. And as many times as I've watched Blade Runner 2049, it felt like a lot of this movie is without purpose. That's one thing. That's one personal thing. Another personal thing is not an indictment on the movie itself. It's me. I can't watch this movie and not think I'm watching Her. I can't watch this movie and not think that I'm watching Westworld. I can't watch this movie and not think that I'm watching anything else that Blade Runner has subsequently inspired. And that's not. Maybe that's the nerd in me. That's the Blade Runner nerd in me, being like, the original Blade Runner is so groundbreaking. Why aren't you groundbreaking, like, story wise? But that it's funny. We're talking about Watchmen before the show.
Let's do it, man.
To me, Watchmen is the perfect example of a show that takes the original concepts and takes the original themes, but completely expounds on it and does something completely original while advancing mythology and creating new mythology. To me, the only problem with this movie is that it felt like it felt like because it was so far removed. If Blade Runner 2049 came out immediately after the original Blade Runner and it dealt with the themes that I was dealing with, it probably would have hit a lot harder. Yeah. But the fact that I did see Her that did the love story, the computer love story, way better. The fact that I saw a whole season of Westworld where they do the beginnings and inklings of a revolution really well on HBO because I saw a number of other because I see movies like The Matrix play with ideas of memory and simulation and all of these concepts.
Even though that is stolen from The Invisibles, but you know,
yeah. But you know,
but yeah, no, I see what you're saying,
exactly. But it's you see how I just wish they would have expounded upon something different. It felt like it was continuing the same themes as the first Blade Runner, but those themes have already been so watered down through the rest of cinema that it's kind of hard for me to grasp onto what they're saying here in this movie. It doesn't feel fresh at all.
Well, it leads to a different.
That's just me.
It leads to another conversation. It leads to the conversation of what is a great sequel. What is paying homage without being too, like you said, nostalgia heavy, without being too, this is just an imitation of the first one. And it takes me back, maybe because I'm on Collider Jedi Council now. Shout out to Jedi Council.
Hey.
It's one of those things.
You guys are doing a great job.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's one of those things where I was talking to Ken about this, the idea of Bob Iger's book. And if you read that book, or at least the excerpts about Star Wars and George Lucas, he literally says that he sat down with George. This is how much you're going to get. You're going to get $4.4 billion, whatever. And obviously the Kathleen Kennedy thing. But then he started George Lucas started to say, hey, man, this is what you got to do.
Right.
Like, you got to introduce this shit, and this shit's crazy, and then fucking aliens from over here do this shit. And Bob is like, all right, cool. Chill out, man. We're paying you $4 billion. And then when he sat down with someone like a J.J. Abrams, the only thing they wanted to do, the only concern that Bob had was just don't offend anyone. Like, literally just make it look like the original and everyone's going to be happy. And I read the Rolling Stone article with J.J. Abrams, and he said he just wanted to take the exact same story structure but make it for a different character, for Rey. Which is fine. I still think The Force Awakens works, but it's that idea of following up a sequel, but it's different though than making like a Spider-Man 2, because or like a sequel that follows right after, like 2-3 years later, versus a sequel to something that's considered, like Sabrina said, a classic, a legendary movie like Blade Runner. A director like any director, give this movie to any director, Blade Runner 2049, 95% of them are going to give you something like 2049, in the sense that they don't want to offend anyone. They don't want to step on any toes because they're so precious to the first one, right? It's that idea of like, I'm paying homage, therefore I don't want to change anything that you created. Does that work in a sequel? I don't know.
And and obviously we've learned that as much as I grew up on Disney and I love a lot of their stuff, they do play it very safe now, right? And that's it's the cash grab thing, right? Like, we don't want to piss people off because we want people to give us money, right? Like, that's it's a business. That's how they work, right? These people are producers and heads of companies, and they have one goal in mind, right? But I think it's interesting because we're on the Star Wars topic. Empire Strikes Back is one of my favorite sequels of all time. It's my favorite Star Wars movie, and it's because not only does it expand on what the original did with expanding the character story development and all that stuff, but even it was also revolutionary as to like how it looked, and maybe that's because it was different directors, know. But it was a very different movie than the original, right? And those are better sequels to me. Godfather 2, right?
Yes,
like if you start talking about good sequels, like Aliens. Alien is still one of my favorite movies, and it's my favorite in the franchise. But Aliens is a great sequel because it's different, right?
It takes that lead. Terminator 2.
Terminator 2, exactly. And that's the thing that I feel like half of 2049 was kind of aiming at, but then they got scared, and they're like, well, we got to bring Harrison Ford back, and we got to bring Sean Young back, and I feel like it wasn't necessary. Right, and that's where the story started getting slower and weaker to me because of that, right? And so it sucks. Like, I don't know who makes those choices, but
studios do,
right? But so maybe they told Denis, this is what you have to do, and otherwise we don't want you to make this movie. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So I think he did an amazing job with what he had. Yes. Right, compared to most sequels that are formulaic and that do try to please the fans, it's one of the better ones. As much as I would change a lot of things about it.
100%. It really is a fascinating conversation of I just search on Google best sequels, right? Best movie sequels, and like you said, T2, Aliens, Godfather 2, Superman 2, Spider-Man 2, The Dark Knight. Like, these are all...
Gremlins too. Masterpiece.
Gremlins too.
Granted, this movie is a bigger movie
Empire
than the
Strikes
original.
Back.
This movie is a bigger movie than the original Blade Runner.
Sure.
Because they expand to multiple different locations. They go to San Diego. They go to all these different places, and we see expanded
It expands
mythology.
well. It shows you what happened to Vegas, which is kind of funny.
Yeah,
It's like, yo,
yeah.
what happened to Vegas? And it's like, yo, what happened to Vegas?
Right. It seems pretty cool.
It exploded,
Yeah.
but
Right.
cool.
Yeah.
Right.
And then San Diego turns into like the literal toilet for LA. And I was
know.
like, yo, all the San Diego people watching this movie are like, really? We're
Also,
the toilet?
where did Chinatown go?
Yeah,
I don't know.
And I was like, I didn't see any taco trucks. Like, I was worried about this 2049 future.
So can I just get into my nitpicky bag about like the little
Please.
things I don't like about
Yeah.
this
Sure,
movie?
man.
This is not. It's be really quick. I swear to God. One thing, again, it's not a criticism against the movie. It's a criticism for me as a Blade Runner fan. When you look at this frame behind us, like you see like all kinds of squares, nicks, like all kinds of shapes and patterns.
Sure.
When you watch Blade Runner 2049, the production design is sparse. Like there is a lot of blank walls. There's a lot of empty spaces. There's a lot of. Whereas you watch the original Blade Runner and Rick Decker can't even walk through the street without bumping into somebody's elbow. There are multiple shots of Ryan Gosling walking through this movie where the streets are completely empty, where the walls are completely clean. So it has a different feel. That's made that again personal preference. That's not a feel that I want to see in Blade Runner. So it already kind of is a layer removed from what I'm expecting. So
Totally agree, man. And that's I didn't know if that was like an age thing for me or a preference thing because I grew up on all these sci-fi fantasy movies, I have a problem with specifically the Star Wars prequels as to how clean they look, right? Like to me it feels personally like I'm watching a video game and like I'm not watching a real world happen in front of my eyes. And I feel like Blade Runner, not only were the streets busy, but the whole,
every shot was packed to the brim with detail and everything.
And that's what makes you like I don't even know where to look, right?
Yeah.
And that's what makes me believe in the story more. And maybe again, I don't know if that's personal preference, but I do agree with that. As much as it was visually stunning, you're right that it's just like okay, well this is just Ryan Gosling walking amongst a very clean like. As much as it looks beautiful, you know it's a green screen, right? Like so, it takes you away a little bit from the movie.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
One more tiny little
give me more, man.
One more tiny little graphics. And again, this bad nitpicky stuff. I get really annoyed in movies when I'm watching a movie and I could look at an entire storyline and think, you could cut this entire storyline and it won't change anything. To me, that's my problem with the Joy. There's two problems. There's a problem with the Joy storyline.
You like Joy?
Yeah, because I do think that if you cut that entire piece out of the movie, the only reason why that whole 45-minute sequence of them hanging out and being together and stuff is there.
You mean the sex scene?
Yeah.
I thought that was a pretty cool scene.
It was
I was
a cool
gonna
scene.
say,
It was a cool
Mackenzie Davis,
Listen,
bro?
it's cool. It's cool.
That's my
It is a
girl.
cool scene. Establishing the revolution and stuff. Cool stuff. Individual scenes in this movie are great.
Right.
It's just to me when it adds up to the bigger picture, none of it connects as well as I want it to.
Sure.
So the only reason I felt like Joy was there is that the henchman for Jared Leto, she can crush her little, she could crush the bot,
machine, yeah.
and so it'll kill her. So that's really the only purpose of that character being there was to be objectified by Ryan Gosling's character.
Yes.
And it didn't really offer much commentary beyond that. Of
Interesting.
course she's a program and hologram, and that's the point. But you think in a movie that presents that point, it would do something to subvert it, but it doesn't really do anything. Even from a story structural level, it doesn't do anything to subvert that.
Well, and it's to me, it's just like trying to rehash the Rachel Deckard relationship. And as much as I liked that scene and I thought it was really cool what they did with it, you're right that it didn't really serve the story. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because to me, it was more so like as soon as I saw Rachel walk in and they're like, "Oh, you guys had a kid," I was just like flipping the table in the theater. I was like, "Why? There's no need for that at all." Especially when like I'm supposed to believe that these characters fell in love when he, like how like weird and violent he was in the first movie. It doesn't make sense.
Sure. What do you guys think of the final third act? And I'll go to you, Sabrina. As far as him being or thinking he is this revolutionary figure to lead kind of this new replicants out of this. Again, what Roy Batty was kind of, like I said in the beginning of this podcast, was supposed to be, represent kind of this like Moses type, Jesus type figure of leading his own people. and then him kind of being deceived and realizing that's not really him. You said you didn't like it because of Westworld already did that.
Oh, no, there's more reasons why I don't like that stuff, but yeah, sure.
I'll start with you, Sabrina.
Yeah.
What do you think of that concept and where it led?
When I first saw it, it worked for me. So I've never seen Westworld, but obviously we'll hear your other reasons for it.
Right.
I kind of like the fact that we followed him. He thinks he's this person, and then he finds out that he's not, and then we're having to deal with like all the aftermath afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I enjoyed that twist.
Yeah.
Or that little like not twist, but yeah.
What about you, man? What was your?
Well, no, I vibed at the idea of like thinking that you're some greater chosen being. The only part that I don't like that the movie setting that up is that there's really no. I mean, obviously the beginning investigation where he interrogates Dave Bautista is like the first clue to that. But otherwise, it's all within Kay's own head, and Kay's not a very emotional. Not easy character to connect with emotionally. So I'm not really invested in his storyline to even begin with. So the fact that it's his own question of like, am I a hero? Am I not a hero? I kind of just automatically check out just from the jump because I don't think his character has a lot of life. And which really says something because Ryan Gosling is honestly one of my favorite actors.
Oh, no
but
way.
yeah, of modern times. But
I thought you were tearing up because you loved Ryan so much.
La La Land, are you kidding me?
Oh,
but
I'm with you, man.
Yeah, but I just think that the fact that question even has to be asked. I mean, it's for one, it's a rehash of the original Blade Runner question. If Rick is a replicant, this one is this guy a natural born replicant. This I don't know. It felt for one, it felt repetitive. For two, Westworld, and for three, I didn't have a connection to Kay, so that's not even the question I even want answered. So
interesting.
I wanted answered while I'm watching the movie. So
I mean, I started to have. I started to really like the Kay character, and even though like I haven't ever been like a huge Ryan Gosling fan because I hated The Notebook so much.
Yeah.
But then I was like, oh, he's actually a really good actor. But it's interesting because I feel like that's what I mentioned earlier, like him just living in that world and being ostracized and being used for the purposes of like, you know, you're a machine that works for us and you have to do what we say, otherwise we're going to terminate you, whatever it is, right? Like that's a kind of a cool and scary thing that I feel like that's what I wish they had focused on more. Whereas like I wish they had gone the route of like Kay is now our Deckard, and where he's definitely a replicant, and we're going to go through his journey. But then he ended up being like just walking us through the journey of the old characters that didn't need to be there. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
And so that's why I didn't like how it ended, and especially like that last scene where he's in the snow and they play the Tears and Rain thing. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, I love this like song, but you guys are
You have to earn
clearly manipulating me into you know just being emotional about it.
Can I just? I think I was the only one in the theater who my brother turned to me and he's like, "Is he dead?" And I was like, I don't know. Is he? I don't think he is. Is he? I don't know. They didn't make that clear if he died.
Well, they made it clear with the Tears and Rain score.
I know. But it's one of those things where it's like that wasn't super. I don't know. I just thought it was kind of bizarre. Any final thoughts on Blade Runner 2049, and we can peace out of here?
I'm done shitting on it.
Yeah.
Not again. Great movie. They're gonna kill me in the comments.
They probably will.
Yeah.
I mean, they're kill me for anything.
It
so.
is fascinating though to see, and I said this before we taped, is that I was fighting with my friends like for an entire week, similar with Joker, where I was like, some people loved it, some people hate it, but so many people I was fighting with, and people in the space, like I think that I don't know about Roca, but like Jeremy Johns, like I discussed this with people, and they love the sequel more, and they think the sequel is much better than the original.
2049,
they think 2049 is better than the original Blade Runner, and I'm just like, it makes me so mad, which is dumb. It doesn't really make me mad.
Matter, yeah.
But yeah, like inside I'm just like, how? Because the biggest thing for me as to why this is my favorite movie is I feel like the new movie, as much as it was beautiful, it missed all the poetic themes that the original like gave us. Like there's so many beautiful as much as there's sparse dialogue in the original Blade Runner, it's all very beautiful, right? Like everything from obviously the Tears and Rain monologue to Gaff saying that line about like it's too bad she won't live. Roy Batty constantly is telling Deckard quiet what's that line where he goes quite a predicament, or what is it, to live in, quite an experience to live in fear.
Yes. Yeah.
That's what it means to be a slave, right? Like, it's like everything that these characters are saying, you're like, yes, I get it. Yes, I relate to that emotion, and it's all about the human condition. And I feel like that's what that's what I was missing in the sequel.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts on 2049?
Yeah, I think it was a pretty decent sequel. I'm happy I saw it in theaters again, strictly for the visuals. Just because, if they did re-release it, I know you mentioned something about that earlier. If they did, I would like to go see it again.
Yeah.
But it's not something I'm gonna like really watch at home. I definitely like the original a lot more. So
Interesting. You, man?
No, I mean, I agree with the poetic part that you just said too. I think there's also a poeticism to the camera movement in the original Blade Runner. Like, there's that one scene where I forget which two characters. It's Tyrell and it might have been Sebastian, but where they're having that conversation and he kills him, and then but you see the camera kind of swirl around the entire room and kind of have this movement and this energy to it. There's not a lot of energy in Blade Runner 2049, so that's why it feels like it's moving a lot slower than it actually is. So
That makes sense.
yeah.
Can I give a quick little, because I like weird stuff, that idea of when love is sitting on her seat and she's looking back, and the fact that she's controlling a drone, I find that to be probably one of the coolest parts of the entire movie, because again, that to me, I like pushing the envelope and pushing the idea of what happens in the future, and imagine this future where military generals or corporate leaders can control, sitting back on their couch, just dropping bombs from a drone. To me, I was like, that's worth the admission for the ticket for me,
Right.
because that's pushing the envelope in a different way that the first movie didn't do. That I was like, that's a potential future that I can see that's super scary, where she's just basically like boom, 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 drone drop, drop, and it's just the idea of like drone warfare being the potential future that we're headed, and that to me was like,
Yeah, and I wish they
crazy.
had explored more of that stuff.
yeah,
right?
because that to me was like, whoa, that's scary.
Yep,
but
agreed.
that's probably my biggest takeaway. And Roger Deakins winning his Oscar, because I thought it was a beautiful
salute to
movie.
that.
And again, shout out to Benjamin Wallfish and Hans Zimmer for
great
trying
score.
to compete with Vangelis, right? Because you're never
100%.
going to be able to like top it, but they did a really good job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dorina, thank you for coming here. I know this was longer than we
Thank you.
thought.
Yeah.
Well, that's what you get when you invite me to
Yeah.
talk about Blade Runner.
I read beforehand was like, bro, it was gonna be 20 minutes. I'm like, I sure, 20 minutes. I don't think this was 20 minutes. But either way, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate you, and thank you for sticking around, because again, I know that's a lot and it's a hassle.
No,
We appreciate it.
I love being here. Thanks for having me for the first time.
Yeah.
I love nerding out with you guys. So
thank you.
Appreciate it.
Time to die.
There you go. Time to die. Alrighty, for the Meaning of Podcast, I am Andres.
This is RB3.
I'm Sabrina.
And Dorina.
Dorina.
Hey.
I
Yeah.
can say it.
We are peacing out. Peace out, guys.